Thank you so much for that warm welcome, Ahmed, and thank you. I always look forward to this opportunity to come here and chat to a very different audience than who I usually get to talk to. So as you heard, my background is not in the medical space. It's not in the healthcare space. That used to intimidate me when I would talk to clinicians and students who obviously are focused on that. But I've learned over the years the value that I can bring to the work that you're doing. So hopefully together we're going to figure out how the creativity and innovation research I do applies to the work that you're all passionate about doing. So I'm not going to talk at length about myself. You already heard my bio, but just to give you a very brief sense of who's here to chat with you this evening. I do refer to myself as a serial entrepreneur, mostly just because it makes my students laugh and they say I'm a serial killer. But I am addicted to starting businesses. Over the years, I've started a lot of different startups, most recently Hope Pet Food, which actually just rebranded. So we have a new company name now. I have to update my slides. But it's a pet food company that uses alternative protein. So it's a sort of sustainability focused social enterprise. And I just fell in love with the idea of starting new businesses and bringing innovations to market. So that's the part I really like. And I've had the opportunity to do that a few times. And as you heard, I decided to go back to school to get a PhD in innovation just because I like to punish myself and keep learning more and more. So I'm almost done that. I'm currently working on my thesis and really focusing on what higher education institutions can do to help innovators, probably like many of you, to actually see your innovations through and bring them to market. I have taught at U of T, Humber, and I now am a professor at Sheridan College. And my role is literally the professor of creativity and innovation. Doesn't get much better for a title than that. That's mostly the reason I took the job. And one more thing to tell you about me, just so you actually know, the person who's up here speaking, I love my animals. This is my puppy. He's a 10-month-old Samoyed, and last night he got sprayed by a skunk. So that's him about to go through his shower after he encountered a skunk in my backyard. So I'm also a little tired today because I was up all night bathing this little butthead who decided to take on a skunk. And his name is Juno. All right, let's get started. Now that we've got, I think, everybody here and we're ready to kick into it. My first question for you, I said that I'm the professor of creativity and innovation. I study these topics, creativity and innovation, and often we use these words interchangeably like they mean the same thing. But actually they are two separate words. They have distinct meanings, and I'm curious to know how you think of or conceptualize these words. When you think of creativity or when you think of innovation, what do those words mean to you? Or what do you think is different about them? Anybody want to take a stab at the meaning of either creativity or innovation? Yeah.
I think creativity is just like any actions that you can improve your current products or process. Innovation is more kind of breakthrough, something brand new, something never exists, something groundbreaking.
Okay, so definitely an element there of novelty, newness, uniqueness. Anybody else have any thoughts about what makes creativity different than innovation? Yeah.
I think creativity is broader. Like most innovations are creative, but not necessarily all creations are.
Like all squares are rectangles, yeah. But not all rectangles are squares. Okay, can you say a little more then about what would make something creative but not innovative?
Like innovation has to be useful in some way. Like it has to be, something that's better than the existing process or thing that it's replacing. And creativity is not necessarily that. Like you're trying to find a bunch of different ways to do something, for example, but they're related.
Okay, I like where we're going here. So we've got novelty. Now we brought usefulness into the conversation. Any other thoughts around creativity or innovation? Do you agree with what's been said so far? Yeah.
For me, I feel like innovation is like the overall approach to a problem, and then creativity is how you would solve that problem. So they're kind of connected.
Okay.
But overall, they're similar.
So what do you think makes up that approach? You said you think of innovation as an approach to something. What do you think defines that approach?
I think like more like let me just rephrase it. For me, for the innovation, it's like for standard research for let's say imaging, I learned the dice coefficient, how you have to use that for verifying. It's been a bit, but
Okay.
yeah, how accurate like your results were. I think creativity is how you got to those results.
Okay, interesting. So solution-oriented results and maybe action-oriented a little bit in there. Anyone else want to contribute some thoughts? So I can tell you the academic definitions of these words in terms of how they are studied in academia. Sometimes the actual definitions don't agree with our sensibilities and how we use the words in colloquial usage. But let me tell you how, I guess, we as scholars study these two concepts. I could have advanced that one. So creativity, we talk about as a combination of novelty and usefulness. So creativity actually has both of those elements that were brought up. Novelty, meaning something that is unique, something that is different, but also usefulness, meaning that it has to meet the bar of actually presenting value to the world. So you can have an idea that no one's ever thought of before, that's very unique, but unless it actually brings value or has some sort of use, doesn't quite meet that threshold of how we define creativity. So when we're talking about creativity, when we're studying it, when we're assessing how creative you might be as a person or how creative an idea might be, we're measuring how unique is it, how novel is it, but also how much use does it have, how much value does it bring to the world. So creativity lives in that space. Now when we're talking about innovation, we're adding another element, and that is action-oriented. So innovation, I like to think of it as creativity in action. We can have creative ideas, we can sit down and brainstorm, we can come up with new concepts, but until we've actually built something or brought it off the page or brought it out of our minds, it just lives in that world of creativity. Innovation is once it actually is presentable here in the world, we can use it, we can touch it, we can interact with it. So they definitely rely on each other. I heard in a lot of your comments, they're definitely related. They have a lot of interconnected pieces. But when we're studying creativity and innovation, that's what we're looking for. Creativity lives a bit more in that theoretical space. We're talking about ideas. We're talking about brainstorming, generating concepts in our mind. And then innovation is bringing it out into the real world and applying it. So if you have a creative idea and then you actually build it, you actually implement it and you see it through, now you have completed innovation. I look at it kind of as a continuum. We have to start with that creative idea, but if we let that idea die on the boardroom floor, we never actually made it to innovation. So when I'm teaching creativity and innovation, I'm looking at both of those concepts. How can we build our ability to generate creative ideas? But then also, how can we see them through to fruition and not just come up with the idea, but actually see the idea come alive? In order to do that, I teach at Sheridan College in my capacity as professor, I teach problem-solving methodologies. And this workshop today is called Design Thinking. Design Thinking is one of the different problem-solving methodologies that we can apply to help us do exactly that, come up with creative ideas, and then hopefully see them through to implementation. So the idea of creative problem-solving methodologies comes to us from this guy, Alex Osborne. He was an ad executive working in the 1950s. He had an ad agency where they would try to come up with creative concepts of how to sell things. Have you ever seen the show Mad Men? It's getting a little dated now, but yeah, some of you have. So if you think of Mad Men, that's what this guy was doing. 1950s ad exec, probably trying to come up with creative new ways to sell cigarettes to babies or some other unethical thing. And he had come up with a process that they were using in their agency to come up with creative ideas. They had basically a step-by-step process that they had come up with as a team that worked very consistently for them. And so Alex Osborne had the idea that maybe he should actually study and codify this process so that anybody else could repeat it, not just be used within his agency, but actually be used by anybody who was interested in coming up with creative ideas. So he went to the local universities. This is in New York State. And he hooked up with some professors teaching at New York State, specifically Sidney Parnes, and they began researching his process that he had implemented in his agency. And they came up with the first ever codified version of a creative problem-solving process. And you can see here his 7-step process that he came up with. Alex Osborne also invented the word brainstorming. If you ever use the word brainstorming, you can thank Mr. Osborne here. So he was really the beginning of sort of a burgeoning effort, especially in America at this time period, in thinking about creativity, not just as something that we're born with, not just as something we do like magic, but something we can codify, learn, practice, and improve on. And over time, his 7-step methodology has been tested. A lot of different authors have looked at it, sort of adapted it to their own purposes. And now we have many, many, many different creative problem solving methodologies that are out there. There's no singular best one. This workshop is about design thinking, which is one of the methodologies, but there are many different ones out there. These efforts, just as kind of a caveat, when I describe creativity and I say that it is novelness plus usefulness, a lot of people push back on that usefulness piece. Like, do you have to create something that is useful in order to be creative? I think it's important to also just note that this work, this area of scholarship, was coming at a time when the economy was really changing. So again, we're talking about 1950s in America. This is a time when labor was really shifting from like factory and labor work into white collar work. And there was this general idea, this sort of Americana, independent thinker idea that I think probably still lives on today, that everybody needed to be a creative thinker. They thought that was going to be the future of the economy. If they could teach every student how to be creative and how to come up with creative ideas, that was really going to define this new economy, this knowledge-based economy. And so there was really a lot of focus at this time into how do we do this? How do we actually teach young people to think differently, to be creative? And so he really was just there, right time, right place. He said, here's my process, and it really kickstarted this whole area of study. So like I said, this workshop is about design thinking. Design thinking, I would say, is probably the most popular and the most widely used creative problem solving methodology that's out there right now. It's become really popular in the last few years. And by no means is it the only methodology, but it's the one you're most likely to encounter out there in industry if you are working in an innovative space. This is really the one that most people are using right now. So it is a 5-step process, a few less steps than the original one from Mr. Osborne, but basically covers the same ground. And design thinking gives us these 5 steps: empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. So we're going to work our way through these different steps. I teach this content typically over like a 14-week course. So what we're going to do today is a very abridged version, but we're going to tap into what are the most important parts of the process, and also how can you hopefully implement them in the work that you're interested in doing. Now, as I said, creativity and innovation, 2 distinct concepts. Really, the design thinking process takes us through both. It starts with creativity, as in how can we think of creative ideas, rather than just solving this problem the same way it's always been solved, rather than just doing the same old thing, the status quo. How do we come up with new ideas and think outside the box? It's kind of the first half, the first chunk. And then once we have that creative idea, how do we actually implement it? How do we test it and see if it works? How do we make any decisions we need to around iteration or improvement, and then deliver it to our customer or our client or our workplace where we work? So we make that bridge from creativity into innovation. So design thinking, or any of these problem-solving methodologies, I think of them both as processes and as mindsets. It's a process as in it gives you a step-by-step path to follow. It literally says, do each of these things in this order, and hopefully you're going to come up with a creative idea at the end. But it's also a mindset or a philosophy or a way of thinking. People who consider themselves design thinkers or designers in this school of thought also approach the work from a certain perspective. They have a set of beliefs and philosophies around what our job is as creative problem solvers. Does anybody know what this is a picture of? Aside from grass and trees, does anyone know what's being depicted in this image? Yeah.
The path that people are taking instead of the common one is forming a new path through the grass.
Absolutely. So we've got a new path that's being formed through the grass. We have what is probably the path people are supposed to take over here. It's paved. But then we've got this other path that's formed. And I actually heard someone say the official name for it. Whoever that was, can you say it again?
Desire path.
A desire path. That's right. So we call this a desire path. And you'll see these anywhere you go, campuses, parks. I took a picture of this one on my campus at Sheridan. And what this represents is a failure in design. Somebody designed this campus, right? Somebody designed where the walkways were going to go, where the roads, the sidewalks, the trees, all of those pieces were designed. And somebody didn't really think about how do humans actually move across the space. In this particular example, do you know what's right back there? Can you see it? The parking lot. And here where I'm standing is the school. And the way that they designed this is there's this lovely curved pathway. It goes around like a nice garden and there's lots to see, but it requires you walking all the way around and then down the sidewalk and to the cars. And that's just not how humans behave, right? My students come out of class and what are they gonna do? They're gonna go straight to their cars or straight to the bus stop. And so they form their own path. Why am I showing you this? Because the mindset, the philosophy behind design thinking is that this is not an example of people behaving badly or people doing the wrong thing. This is an example of people who have done a bad job of designing a space. They didn't understand how humans behave. They didn't understand what humans wanted and needed, so they designed something that didn't work. The general philosophy, the general vibe, I guess, in design thinking is that those human users come first and they are always right. The way that humans move, that's the correct way. So we have to design to their needs. Design thinking puts our user first and their wants and needs first, and we are to design to them. Ooh. It's also cyclical and iterative. So even though this is how the process is usually depicted, step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, in actual practice, it almost never looks that clean. It is not intended to. It is intended to be cyclical and iterative. Cyclical meaning we have to repeat either independent steps or the entire process. And iterative meaning that each time we repeat something, we get better at it. It's the philosophy of being cyclical and iterative is that there's no such thing as failure. We learn through our mistakes, we learn through doing, and that we're going to learn a lot more by trying something than we are through just sort of sitting around and talking about it. So the process is intended to give us this nice little neat framework that we can build our work off of. But once we actually get into it and we start working, we might find it actually ends up looking a lot more like these messy depictions that show we have to go back and redo some of our work. Finally, it's inclusive. Design thinking, I think this is why it has become so popular in sort of this time period, is that, as I said, it's all about designing for people and thinking about who is potentially going to be using my solution. And not just who is like the most common user, but even who is the most marginalized user and what would they need. It's always about designing with rather than for our users. So keeping our users central and in mind at all times. You can take any of these problem-solving methodologies and really boil them down to 3 major steps. I think of it as step 1, understanding the problem, making sure you actually know what you are here to solve. A large number of innovations end up failing simply because the people who came up with them didn't understand the problem they were trying to solve. So we need to make sure we have all the information from the right perspective before we even start solving. Once we're really clear on the problem, we understand the need, we understand who we are solving for, then we can start finding solutions. We don't want to get to that part until we're ready for it. This is where creativity comes in, coming up with those ideas, generating potential solutions. And then once we have found the idea that we like, implementation, taking that idea off the page and actually doing it. That's that innovation piece. How do we actually take the idea, test it in the real world with real human beings, see if it works the way we think it will work, and ultimately implement it for our audience. So we're going to work through these stages together. We're going to explore what they look like in actual practice and how you might do them. And I'm kind of grouping, there are the 5 steps in the design thinking model, but I'm sort of grouping them into these 3 major pieces. So the first one being understanding the problem. In the design thinking model, the first step is called empathize. And again, I think that this is part of why design thinking has become so popular. This was really the new addition that the framework of design thinking brought to the table. This was the first time we saw empathy as a stage in the problem-solving process. So the first step in the design thinking process is to empathize and then define. What do we mean by that? I love this quote from Albert Einstein. It really typifies the design thinking process. He said, if I was given an hour in which to solve a problem upon which my life depended, I would spend 40 minutes studying it being the problem, 15 minutes reviewing it, and then 5 minutes solving it. This is really how design thinking is stacked in terms of your time and effort. We're going to spend 40 minutes of our hour just trying to understand and learn everything there is to know about the problem. checking our work, making sure we're clear, and then our last 5 minutes are spent solving it, which is really counterintuitive and not how most of us work. Most of us immediately rush to coming up with solutions. This first step is so important, and yet, as I just said, a lot of practitioners end up skipping it. So in order to make this a little more real and easier to understand, I have this awesome video. It's a little dated now, but I think it does such a good job of illustrating it. I'm gonna play it for you in a sec, but first let's do a little bit of thinking around this. So this gentleman you see on the screen, his name is Clay Christensen. He was a big thinker in innovation and entrepreneurship. Unfortunately, he just passed away, but he really redefined the way we think about innovation and exactly what we're talking about right now, which is understanding what the problem really is. And in this video, he is going to talk about a time that he was hired as a consultant by a big fast food company. I think it's McDonald's. He doesn't actually say the name, but he was hired by a big fast food restaurant, and his job was to help them sell more milkshakes. This company had milkshake machines, milkshake ingredients. They had invested in being able to offer milkshakes, and they weren't selling enough to make it profitable. So they hired him and his team to come in and figure out, how do we sell more milkshakes? Now, if I was to pose that question to you, all of you very bright people who probably have been to fast food restaurants in your life, if I was to say, how do we sell more milkshakes? What would your gut instincts be? What would you do if you were asked to solve this problem? What would you come in and do to help them sell more milkshakes? What are some of the ideas that come to mind? Yeah. Marketing. Tell me more. How might we market?
Making ads, offering free samples to people so that they're more aware of the product.
Okay, so awareness campaigns, investing in making sure everyone knows we have milkshakes now, getting the word out. Definitely. What else might we do? Yeah.
Make them cheap.
Make them cheap. Play with the price. Maybe we'll offer discounts. Maybe, see what we can do with the price.
Go to an actual fast food chain and see how people actually buy different products.
Have you seen this video before? Okay, and what would you be looking for if you were to do exactly that? Go into the place and
What
see.
do people usually pair with milkshakes? As in, do they buy burgers with milkshake and maybe offer a combo so that people buy more milkshakes?
Okay, we're gonna come back to that. Very good suggestion. I saw some other hands. Was there any other ideas what you do? Yep.
Just make it a tradition that burgers go with milkshakes.
Oh, just change the cultural zeitgeist. Everyone knows you have to.
like new food. Like always, if you want to eat the burgers, you need to eat it with milkshake. Otherwise, it's not a.
So how do we change the culture around that? Maybe through advertisements, maybe get, I don't know, influencers eating burgers and having milkshakes. We try to put this image out there.
How do you show a culture? So if you want to show a culture, there's like a whole bunch of things that you can do. Many years you need to invest so that this is the in American culture, burger go with milkshake. You need to show that.
Okay, you're playing the long game. You're like, we're gonna sell it, we're gonna make this 5 years from now, everyone's gonna be having milkshakes. That's good. I like that. I don't mean to tease. That is a very good idea. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
Maybe even go to school and provide free samples to the kids, and because then they like it, and then we will ask for the parents to go.
Okay, so we can give out free samples, and also if we're giving out free samples, we might also ask people what do you think of our milkshakes, right? And maybe there's something we can do there. Do we need to change the flavor? Do we need to how can we make our milkshakes better? That might be part of the conversation.
And also partner with fast food chains like McDonald's or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So this way, make it more available. It's similar idea for Coca-Cola or PepsiCo. They put in the school, they put in the gym, and
Right.
put into the public place.
Get the milkshakes into our kids, start them young on the milkshakes, and then we develop the culture, the American
That's the
culture
culture
to eat the milkshakes. Hey, you guys are really investing in the long game here for the milkshake sales. Any other thoughts on what you would instinctively do if you were trying to sell more milkshakes? So we tinker with the price, maybe we tinker with the recipe, the marketing, the awareness, the campaigns, all those things.
And the weather, go to some hot countries and sell it.
We're gonna change the weather, make sure it's always hot and sunny so people want milkshakes. Maybe sell them in the summer, right? Some summer promotions. Okay,
Or
we
go
got
to
some
the
good
beach
ideas.
areas like Miami or Florida.
Okay, so that is exactly pretty much all the things you guys just said, except for you because you're in trouble. Those are exactly the things this company did. They tried tinkering with the price, doing new marketing, investing in discounts, and I don't know if they tried to change the culture, but definitely put out, lots of imagery and tried to compete on getting people to buy milkshakes, and it was just having no effect. The numbers were not budging. They were not selling more milkshakes. And so we're going to hear about what his team did and see what they did differently that we may not have thought of that helped them change the way that they were selling milkshakes.
Hi, my name's Clay Christensen. I'm a professor at the Harvard Business School. I brought with me a set of puzzles. All the way we've thought makes motivation difficult to achieve. The most helpful way we've thought of it so far is that we actually hire products to do things for us. And understanding what job we have to do in our lives for which we would hire a product is really the key to cracking this problem of motivating customers to buy what we're offering. So I wanted just to tell you a story about a project we did for one of the big fast food restaurants. They were trying to goose up the sales of their milkshakes. They had just studied this problem up the gazoo. They brought in customers who fit the profile of the quintessential milkshake consumer, and they'd give them samples and ask, could you tell us how we can improve our milkshakes so you'd buy more of them? Do you want it chocolatey or cheaper, chunky or chewier? They get very clear feedback. They would then improve the milkshake on those dimensions, and it had no impact on sales or profits whatsoever. So one of our colleagues went in with a different question on his mind, and that was, I wonder what job arises in people's lives that cause them to come to this restaurant to hire a milkshake. So we stood in a restaurant for 18 hours one day and just took very careful data. What time did they buy these milkshakes? What were they wearing? Were they alone? Did they buy other food with it? Did they eat it in the restaurant or drive off with it? It turned out that nearly half of the milkshakes were sold before 8 o'clock in the morning. The people who bought them were always alone. It was the only thing they bought, and they all got in the car and drove off with it. So to figure out what job they were trying to hire it to do, we came back the next day and stood outside the restaurant so we could confront these folks as they left, milkshake in hand. And in language that they could understand, we essentially asked, excuse me please, but I got to sort this puzzle out. What job were you trying to do for yourself that caused you to come here and hire that milkshake? And they'd struggle to answer, so we'd then help them by asking other questions like, well, think about the last time you were in the same situation, needing to get the same job done, but you didn't come here to hire a milkshake. What did you hire? And then as we put all of their answers together, it became clear that they all had the same job to do in the morning, and that is they had a long and boring drive to work. And they just needed something to do while they drove to keep the commute interesting. One hand had to be on the wheel, but somebody had given them another hand and there wasn't anything in it. And they just needed something to do while they drove.
Okay, who is surprised to hear that more than 50% of milkshakes were sold before 8 a.m.? Right? Not an instinctive result, right? And so now that we have this information, they went and stood just like you said in the restaurant, and they did this observation to understand not just who is buying the milkshake, but why are they buying the milkshake? And they were able to put that together with some primary research, doing a bit of observation, watching, collecting statistics, understanding who, when, why they were buying it, and then actually speaking to them and trying to ascertain, in given very strange language, what job were you trying to get done, but to ascertain really why were these people buying the milkshake. So now that we have a deeper understanding, suddenly we can start thinking of solutions that are a little bit more creative and a little bit more targeted. We talked before about what would you instinctively do to sell more milkshakes, and we came up with some general answers, general things we could do. But now that we have this information, does that spark any new ideas for you? What might you do now to sell more milkshakes?
So go to the highway gas station where we have like Ontario, whatever the parking areas, and also to see whether make some research to see what are the people go long distance travel, and then targeted for those people for marketing campaign.
Right, so position ourselves where people are commuting, position our marketing where people are commuting, maybe those billboards where people are driving, yep.
Improve the product in a way that'll affect the user, so like make the container be able to hold it for longer.
Yeah, and what are we doing when we're driving our car? We're probably putting it in a cup holder, right? So does it fit in the cup holder nicely? Is it something you can carefully drink and not get it on your work clothes as you're commuting? We can think about how they're interacting with it. What about that time of day factor? Is there something we can do with this? It's before 8 a.m. Is there something we can do with that?
Promotion, maybe buy one get one free, or something like a discount, limited discount for the time.
Yeah, of course we could do something like that. Yeah.
A lot of people listen to the radio on their way to work.
Ooh.
So maybe have radio ads going on that remind you that did you get your milkshake?
Yeah, good point. Thinking about where are we putting that marketing, putting it on the radio when people are commuting. Yeah.
So I work in a restaurant.
Okay.
And
oh, good.
it's a vegan restaurant, so many healthy options.
So no milkshakes.
No, we have smoothies.
Yes.
We have healthy smoothies.
Yes.
The timing we sell most of the smoothies are the people work out. Like we have so many yoga sessions and meditation groups going on in that area, and people would come and buy healthy smoothies after they finish workout or before they go to work, and like we have a happy hour during that time.
Okay.
We sell like a lot of healthy smoothies that. So I think, and recently we have like I don't know if anyone knows Taylor Swift. She said.
Does anyone here know Taylor Swift?
Actually, I just know her name. I don't know anything about her. So like she said that she in her childhood she was used to like having a chocolate milkshake with a burger.
Right.
And they picked up that line and they're just selling their burger and their chocolate smoothie based on that.
Gotcha. Well, definitely, I think one of the things I can pull from what you were saying as well is this idea of the healthy smoothie. So is a milkshake a great breakfast idea? Maybe not. Maybe if we know that's why our consumer is buying at that time, maybe we offer some healthy alternatives that are a good breakfast, right? Maybe we promote them as high in protein, or I don't know what people like with smoothie things. Yeah.
Since because of the period of the time it's coming, like in the morning, we can associate it with maybe a bagel, buy a smoothie with a bagel, especially because those consumers are only taking the smoothie, so they are probably getting their breakfast somewhere else.
Yes, so we could package it with our breakfast items. Maybe you get smoothie, get a discount on a breakfast sandwich. Yeah.
We already know that the half of the milkshakes are sold before 8 a.m. So we need to find a way to what to do to sell it more after that.
True, we could also target that other half for sure. We could do things like make the milkshakes coffee flavored, put caffeine in them, right? I would like that. I need my caffeine in the morning. So anyway, hopefully what this illustrates for you is what we mean when we say understanding the problem. Of course, we know what the problem is. The client in this case told us the problem. We're not selling enough milkshakes. And at face value, we can come up with general ideas of what that might mean and general ideas of how to solve it. But it's not until we gather that detailed data and really understand the root of the problem that we can start generating solutions that are going to be more targeted, more creative, and more meaningful. So yes, we're not selling enough milkshakes. Okay, that's a general problem, but understanding that people want to buy them as a breakfast item to take on their long, boring commutes in the morning, this totally changes the whole shape of the problem, right? It gives us that new perspective. So that's what we mean when we say we need to understand the problem. We need to have more than just our vague personal understanding of it. We need to have a more detailed and especially user-oriented idea of the problem. I would never have guessed that people were buying milkshakes before 8 a.m. because I don't do that. But of course, I'm not the only person in the world. Surprising to me, there are other people with other perspectives, and we need to hear those perspectives before we start designing our products. So that's one way to think of understanding the problem. Now, what design thinking asks us to do, as I said, it calls that first step empathize. And when they named it that, they brought a whole new flavor to the problem-solving process that really hadn't been incorporated before. They brought in this idea of not just understanding who our user is and what they want, but empathizing with them. Now, I'm sure you all know what the word empathy means. What do you think of when you hear of empathize? In the context of problem solving, what do you think that means? Yeah.
You understand the causes and the results of the problem on the user itself, and like how
On
it
the
might be
user
affecting
themselves?
them on a day-to-day basis.
On a day-to-day basis?
As a kid, I was always confused between sympathize and empathize, and how I remembered it as sympathy is something when somebody tells me their problem, I feel bad for them.
Mm-hmm.
But empathize is me actually putting myself in their shoes.
Perfectly said. And that's exactly what the design thinking process actually asks us to do. It's not enough to just understand the problem that our potential customer is having. We have to actually put ourselves in their shoes. And this helps us in a number of ways. For one, it helps illustrate exactly what the problem is and give us that perspective. But it also helps us design solutions that are really going to work for that human element. Remember, I talked about the desire path and how humans actually behave and how humans actually navigate the world. Empathy asks us to step inside those shoes and kind of experience it for ourselves before we start coming up with ideas or solutions. I'm going to show you a very short clip from this video. This comes from an organization called IDEO. They are kind of the leaders of design thinking. And this is a project they did in combination with a hospital. So I thought it was a good example for our audience here today. And they were trying to do a design project within this hospital. Before they rushed in to actually come up with ideas, they did a massive empathy project, meaning trying to understand, put themselves in the shoes of the users who move through their hospital. I'm going to show you a very short clip and then we'll talk about it. And just like trigger warning, it's a little emotional. So sometimes I get a little emotional watching it. So that's your warning if you get emotional when you watch things. Austin Matthews. Hit him with the full like Uber Eats. So you can see how when we're doing a project in a space as complicated as a hospital, there is this overarching human element that we might not even think of. We might kind of take that bird eye view of thinking about solutions, what's the need, how do we kind of come up with quick, effective solutions. But design thinking says we need to actually get inside the experience of those people who are using whatever we're creating. And in a hospital, that's incredibly complex because there are so many conflicting stories that are happening all the time. The people that you pass when you're moving through these hallways are going through all sorts of things that we don't even know what they are. And so before we can start designing things like, I think in this example, they were planning a new waiting room space or trying to reimagine how the hospital was laid out. And before they even started doing that, they did this massive empathy project to understand what are people coming into that space with, what are they dealing with, what are they experiencing, and what are their many diverse needs. And they got that sort of deeper understanding before they started designing. So it's very easy for us to take a detached approach and to think of something like designing a physical space as a purely architectural project. But when we get down to understanding the users who are using that space, it allows us to really design and tailor for them. So when we're talking about design thinking, we're talking about that human element, again, always being central and being first. The people we're designing for are more important than the solution that we're coming up with. It has to work for them. It's just been good. Every time I have a video, it's always gotta get that far. There we go. There we go. So how do we actually do this part? How do we develop this understanding? Sounds great. Sounds like a good idea, right? Make sure we understand the problem before we dive into it. But how do we actually build that understanding? There's a few different tools that we can use in practice. And these are the kind of the most common ones that I see used in the field or that I've used. The first one is just observation. So that project I just showed you, that hospital project, that's what they did to begin with, or even the milkshake video. They just stood in the fast food restaurant and observed. It's kind of the easiest way to start collecting data. I think some of the folks in this room who are in the MedVention program, that's where you start, is just observing what are the things that happen in the hospital, where are there problems or hiccups, where are there things we can improve upon. And we do that just by observing, or ethnography, meaning research that's done in place through observation. That's a great place to start. And then typically interviews are the gold standard for the way to really develop that empathetic understanding. Once we've seen what's happening, actually talking to people gives us that lived experience to hear from them what they're experiencing, what they're feeling, what their underlying needs are. So we talk to people. Typically in the world of design thinking, we say you have to talk to at least 100 people before you start moving forward with your innovation. That's what we teach entrepreneurs as well, at least 100 people. That means you have a pretty good perspective of the problem and you're ready to start moving forward. And then a new space that's kind of burgeoning in this type of research is online ethnography, which is doing observation but in an online capacity. So now that people live their lives very publicly online through things like social media, we can actually observe them just by looking at their behavior online. Can anybody think of like a platform you might go to if you wanted to observe someone through their online presence?
Reddit.
Reddit's my favorite because people are like, they use full sentences and stuff. So we can really learn a lot about people through their Reddit posts. But where else could we go to find out how people think and feel about things? Where else do people live out their lives publicly?
Facebook.
Facebook. Definitely used to be primarily Facebook. Now that one's a bit dying. Instagram, yeah.
Use AI.
Use AI to scrub anything really, right, from the internet, or even just talk to a chat bot and tell it to impersonate a certain user group, and it can pull that data and kind of create that context. Any of these things, even things like reviews, online reviews, anywhere where people are posting their thoughts and feelings online, we can use that as well. So it used to be we had to actually interview and meet with people to hear their sentiment, but now people are really willing to share their sentiment online in these public spaces, and more studies are being done just using sentiment analysis from something like Twitter, and AI helps us do that because we can scrub Twitter really fast and get a whole bunch of content at once. But online ethnography is super useful because we can do it in our pajamas at home. We don't have to interview people, so it's really time saving. But I still think interviews are the gold standard because we're sitting down with an actual human, and when we're talking about a word like empathy, I don't think there's a replacement for really being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes compared to actually talking to them and learning from them. So when we want to understand the problem, we start by collecting this primary data. We do that by observing. That gives us a good general sense. And then hopefully we can dive even deeper by interviewing them and getting a better sense of the problem from their perspective. Once we have done that, the next stage in the design thinking process is define. We start with empathy, gathering those perspectives, and then we define the problem. What this means is that we need to put a frame around the specific problem we want to solve. We can't really come up with ideas if we have too much information and too many perspectives and too many ways of looking at it. So we have to put on our blinders a little bit to pick one specific element of the problem that we want to solve. This is a difficult part to do because usually we want to come up with solutions that work for everyone and we want to solve everything. But unfortunately, we have to get really specific about exactly who are we solving the problem for and what are we trying to achieve. So if we talked about that McDonald's milkshake problem, right? And he just stepped out, but the person up there talked about, well, only 50% of the people are buying the milkshake before 8 a.m. So we have to decide, is that who we're solving for? Are we coming up with an idea for those 8 a.m. buyers, or are we solving for someone else? We can't solve for both at once because they are two different user groups. They have different needs. So we have to pick who specifically are we solving for. And the more specific we're able to be, the more tailored our solution will be. So in that example of the milkshakes, if we pick specifically those commuters who are stopping before 8 a.m. and getting something that they can drink in their long commute to keep them busy, that's a very specific use case. Those people have a very specific use. It's going to be different than another group of customers, right? So defining asks us to get specific in this way. It's a bit of a science because we can use data to guide us, but it's also a bit of an art because it requires you to kind of use your intuition and follow what you're interested in solving. So here's an example of what this might look like. This is a problem that we are always trying to address in higher education, this idea that our students need more mental health support. This is a huge problem that we've been facing for a long time. There's always calls for universities and colleges to better support students' mental health. So what do people usually do? What do you usually see in an institutional approach to problem solving? Based on things like hunches, intuition, and also what's the cheapest and easiest idea to implement, that's usually what ends up happening. So does this sound familiar to you? It says, this is some online ethnography I did. I stole this off of Twitter, X. It says, universities say, need help, use our mental health services. The services in question, a golden retriever that comes to the library once a week, one therapist for 40,000 students, and a bathroom stall you can cry in for free. Does that sound familiar to your higher education experience? I'm sorry. It's not funny, but it's funny. So typically this is the approach we see. Like, okay, students need mental health supports. Let's get a therapy dog to come on reading week. That'll solve it. Or let's offer yoga for free in the student center. That will solve it. But it doesn't really get to the user need, right? It doesn't really define the problem in a way that's going to make a huge impact on your life. If you're a student suffering from mental health issues, none of these things is really going to change that for you. So what we do instead is we start by creating a point of view statement. This focuses us in on who is our user that we are solving for. Again, if we go back to that milkshake example, who is the specific customer we're trying to target? If it's the students who need mental health supports, students is a wide umbrella term. And I can tell you, as someone teaching today in 2024, a student is a hugely broad category. I have students who are parents with kids at home. I have students who live at home with mom and dad and are just fresh out of high school. I have students who are commuting to school for hours on a GO train. I have students who live on residence. It's a huge, huge umbrella. So we can't really come up with one solution and say, well, this will work for all students. We have to get more specific. So the point of view statement forces us to focus in on exactly who are we solving for. We can't create a solution for everyone because something that's designed for everyone works for no one. So instead we have to decide, who are we designing for? That's the first half of the define stage. Who are we solving for? So here's an example, the student mental health example I just gave. Instead of saying I'm going to help all students with their mental health, as much as I would like to do that, I can focus in on one particular group. One group who I often feel bad for is my students who have to commute for over an hour in order to get to school. I feel like they have a particular challenge that's maybe not being addressed. So I can pick that point of view. I'm going to solve specifically for my students who have to commute for over an hour. I feel like there's no services for them. So we start with that point of view. Once we have a point of view, or we know who we're solving for, we create a how might we question. The how might we question prompts us to start coming up with ideas. It basically says, now that I've done all my research, I've gathered my data, I understand the problem, and I know who I'm solving for, here is the specific frame I'm putting around the problem to define how I want to solve it. Creating a how might we question is tricky because it has to be specific enough that we know how to start coming up with ideas, but broad enough that it allows us to be creative. The whole point of this exercise is to come up with creative solutions. So if you say something really hyper-specific, like how might I create an app for students where they can chat with their friends while they're commuting, it doesn't really leave me room to be creative. It's very, very specific. So we want to create a how might we prompt that communicates who we're solving for, what the problem is we're trying to solve, and gives us room to be creative. So in my example here, I've got how might we make being at home alone feel as supported and connected as meeting with our friends in a club on campus. So that could be my problem definition. I've zeroed in on exactly who I think has the problem, and I've zeroed in on exactly why I think they need a solution. They need a way to make connections to other people from home. Once we have defined the problem, we know who we're solving for and what kind of solution we're looking for, now it's time to get to ideation, usually everybody's favorite part. This is where we start coming up with potential solutions. There are two phases to ideation. There's the divergent thinking and the convergent thinking stage. Can anybody tell me what divergent thinking is? Yeah.
Basically come up with as many solutions to the problem as you can.
Absolutely, so there's an element of quantity there. We're coming up with as many ideas as we can. Any other thoughts of what it means to be divergent?
Thinking differently?
Thinking differently, absolutely.
I think like it doesn't necessarily have to be reasonable solution to your problem. It's just like brainstorming and getting all the ideas so that you have an idea of what to think for the task.
Perfectly said. Those are exactly the three elements that make up divergent thinking. So we're aiming for quantity. It's all about coming up with lots of ideas. It's about coming up with ideas that are novel or outside the box, not limiting ourselves, thinking differently. And it's about, oh my goodness, what did you just say?
Like not necessarily
Oh, right.
reasonable solution.
It's about being non-judgmental. So divergent thinking is also not judging the way we think. We're not judging our ideas. These are bad ideas, good ideas, silly ideas, but instead just letting ourselves come up with kind of uninterrupted ideas. The other side of this is convergent thinking. Can anybody tell me, based on that, now we know what divergent thinking is, we can guess what is convergent thinking, the opposite.
You're paring down the ideas that you come up with to reasonable ones.
Definitely. So we're paring down. We're getting more specific. We're selecting. Any other contributions to that idea? So there's one other element to it. It's definitely about picking ideas or getting selective. It's also about trying to get it right. So there's an element to convergent thinking that's about finding the right answer. All of you are probably very good at convergent thinking. We are trained in how to think in a convergent way since like day one kindergarten. This is about getting the right answer on the test. This is about knowing the right facts. It's using our memory and the things we've learned and applying it correctly. So we're all very practiced in convergent thinking, but divergent thinking can be a little uncomfortable for a lot of us. In the creative problem solving process, we want to use both. We want to give ourselves the opportunity to think in a divergent way, and we want to apply our convergent thinking. So let's start with divergent thinking. This term was first coined by J.P. Guilford, again in the 1950s. As I said at the beginning, this is when the scholarship for creativity really began. This is when people started thinking about creativity in a scholarly way. And he was an American psychologist who basically said what I just did. We're all really well trained in convergent thinking. We all know how to do it. We all practice it every day. But the real gap in terms of creating that next generation of creative individuals is to teach them how to be more divergent. And so he came up with something called the alternative uses test. Well, he came up with many tests, but his most famous is the alternative uses test. You're all familiar with an IQ test, right? IQ tests, which generally are kind of supposed to measure your intelligence level. So the alternative uses test is a test he devised to measure your creativity or your divergent thinking ability. And it goes like this. He would hand you an everyday object, most famously a brick, and he would say, okay, we all know what this is used for. We've all seen bricks before. How many ways can you think of to use a brick outside of its normal usage? So anybody shout out right now, how could you use a brick? What are some alternative ways we could use a brick?
A hammer.
A hammer.
Paperweight.
Doorstop. Paperweight.
Leveling a table.
To level the table, yeah.
To prop your phone up against.
Sure. Hold up your phone.
Weapon.
Fixing.
A weapon.
Fixing.
Facing something? Weapon, you could use it to hurt a person or smash a window or some other thing, yes. So this is what the alternative uses test looks like. You're given a very short period of time and you're meant to generate as many ideas as you can, and then you would be evaluated, just like an IQ test would evaluate your intelligence, this would evaluate your creativity. And you would be scored on these parameters: your fluency, your flexibility, your originality, and your elaboration. Fluency, how many ideas were you able to generate? In 5 minutes, were you able to come up with 5 ideas, 50 ideas, 500 ideas? The more you came up with, the more fluent you are. Flexibility means how different were your ideas. When I do this with my students, they do come up with a lot of ideas, but then when I look through their ideas, it says something like, you could use the brick to smash a window, you could use the brick to smash a car, you could use the brick to smash a burglar. And okay, yeah, those are maybe a little bit different, but not the most flexibility. There's usually a lot of smashing involved, but not a lot of other conceptual categories. So when we talk about flexibility, we're saying, can we think in many different directions? It's one thing to just go down one path, how many things can I smash? But it's another to think in many different directions at once. Originality, this is really the heaviest weighted in the test. It's weighted as more important than the others. Originality is how statistically unique is your idea. And this would be measured by looking at the ideas of your peers across the test. If you came up with an idea that no one else did, you would score very high in originality, whereas if everyone said that same idea, it would score very low. Again, of these different sort of metrics, originality is the closest linked with creative potential. And then finally, elaboration, which means how elaborate is the idea away from the original concept. So when we say things like doorstop or paperweight, in those imaginative situations, it still looks like a brick, right? It's just a brick holding a door or a brick on a stack of paper. But what if instead we said we're going to use a mortar and pestle to break the brick down into clay, and then we're going to add water and glue to form that clay into a sculpture, and we're going to sculpt something. That is a very elaborate idea. I had to go a long conceptual way away from a brick to get to that final idea. So when we're talking about divergent thinking, this is what we're talking about. But although divergent thinking gets all the hype, most people are like, yeah, divergent thinking, that is creativity. The reality is convergent thinking is very important in the creative process as well. Because you'll remember from the very beginning when I said the scholarly definition of creativity, it is novelty plus another element, usefulness. And we need our convergent thinking in order to be able to evaluate the quality of the idea and whether or not it actually has value. And so if we were to revisit that alternative uses test and look at all the ideas we came up with, we could also think about how practical is this idea? How influential would this idea have an impact? Would it be a positive idea? Would it actually add value? Or is it actually a very silly, very bad idea? So our convergent thinking is important. It's not like if you're divergent, you are just magically creative. You need to have a balance of both. But what we have found through studies is that these two processes, while both equally important, are best used distinctly. Meaning that if you sit down with the goal of diverging and only diverging, you will be more successful in coming up with creative ideas. Then once you have had your divergent thinking phase, you can apply things like logic, critical thinking, analysis to narrow down the ideas. If you do what most of us do, you tend to oscillate between the two all the time. You would say an idea and then immediately judge it. You might say a couple ideas, then stop and say, okay, let's go through them and pick one. Studies have shown us that the most effective way is to set a period of time where you are just diverging, no judgment, no thought about whether the ideas are good. Your only goal is quantity. How many ideas can I come up with? And to push yourself as far as you can, like 100 ideas, 150 ideas. Then once you're satisfied with the quantity you have, now switch gears and move completely into convergent thinking and evaluate the ideas. The way I think of it is we're all very good at being critical of ourselves, so we can actually hold that off as long as possible. There will always be time to criticize ourselves, but what we really need to practice is allowing ourselves to diverge. So you can think about in your own creative process, if you're trying to come up with ideas, give yourself that space to be divergent. Give yourself that time and space to come up with ideas. And in fact, the most recent scholarship also shows us that we are most successful at that divergent piece when we're not trying to do it, which is tricky because usually we're sitting down to brainstorm at a given time in a given way. But studies show us that the most effective way to have those sort of brilliant moments of inspiration is actually to digest the information, walk away, and do something completely else. Do you find your best ideas come to you like in the shower or when you're trying to sleep or when you're walking in the woods? If you find that, it's very normal. It's a studied phenomenon. And the idea is that inspiration comes best when we're mind wandering. So if you're sitting there being like, come up with a creative idea, come up with a creative idea, that is actually the worst thing for your creativity. Best thing to do is to step away and take a breather, which can be hard to do if you're specifically being asked to do a task. And remember, it's cyclical. So just because you come up with an idea doesn't mean that has to be the final idea. You can always improve on it. You can iterate. You can go back to your customers, ask them for feedback, and keep refining it. And then finally, our final steps are to start taking action. So that's the innovation piece. How do we take that creative idea that we came up with and actually start implementing it? In the design thinking world, we talk about this in the modes of prototyping and testing. So what does this mean? Instead of just delivering your final idea in its final form to your customer, another sort of innovative piece of design thinking is the idea that we should invest as little as possible until we have as much data as possible. Meaning, if we have a great idea, we should not invest all of our money and time and resources into building that idea, but instead should create opportunities to test out, does my idea work the way I think it will? And we can test in a few different ways. We can build prototypes, low and high fidelity prototypes. We can do service-based tests, and we can do some other creative tests. I think I have a slide for each one. Do I? No, I don't. Okay, so we'll talk about each one. So low and high fidelity prototypes. A low fidelity prototype means a very cheap version. Could be a sketch, could be a paper prototype, something you're just able to do with no investment. A high fidelity prototype means using things like 3D printers to actually build working models. Can take a little bit more money, but then it also gives you something people can actually touch and test, which will give you better information. So we can build physical prototypes. That's kind of what most people think about when you hear the word prototyping. If your idea is not a physical thing though, you may still want to test it. What if your idea is a training program or a new process that you want to implement? Those things are harder to prototype. So we can still test them in the form of doing things like role plays, pilots, where we can test it out on a small scale, gather data, see if it works, and then implement it in a bigger way. And then we can also get creative. So Wizard of Oz testing is when we actually don't develop our technology at all, but we pretend that we have developed it in order to get customer feedback. The most famous example of this I know is, actually, no, I have a news story. I used to have a story about IBM, but now I just saw one on the news and it's so much more modern, so I'm going to use it. Has anybody ever seen these Amazon to-go stores where the idea is you can walk in and just take the product and you don't have to stop and pay? Has anybody seen the recent news that just came out about this? Okay, so you have the experience, you go into the store, you pick up the product and you walk out. You're like, wow, that was so amazing. Technology has come so far. It just charged me and I didn't have to do anything. Well, it just came out that in fact, they don't have the technology to do this. What they do have is 1,000 low-paid workers in India watching you on cameras and manually typing it in. So for you, the consumer, you think you're having this magical technical experience, but really it's completely done manually behind the curtain. That's why it's called Wizard of Oz testing, because something's going on behind the curtain and you're not aware of it. So if you have an idea, now I'm not saying that that's an ethical or good thing to do, that's not what I'm saying, but if you have an idea that requires advanced technology that you don't have the ability or the money to build, you can still test the concept with Wizard of Oz testing. You can try to create an environment where the consumer gets to have the experience of the final product, even if you're doing it manually behind the curtain, and you can see if it works or if it doesn't work. Concierge testing is the same thing, only it's a little more transparent. The customer knows that you're doing it manually. So this would be like if you wanted to test out like a chat bot, but instead of actually developing the chatbot, you started by having a real person answer questions, test that out, and then move to developing the technology. So why do you think we prototype? Why do you think this is an important part of the design thinking process? What value do you see in this concept? Any value? Yeah.
It gives you some indications of maybe early failures that you might encounter.
Definitely. So if we're going to fail, we want to fail before we've invested our life savings and sold our home to fund the idea, right? So if we can fail right away, I mean, nobody wants to fail, but at least we can learn quick and easy, and then maybe we can iterate and improve the idea. So definitely we want to get that failure out of the way right away. Any other ideas why we might prototype?
All right. It might help boost your confidence as well when you launch the thing.
Sure, yeah, because you have a lot of questions going into starting anything new. Is this really going to work? Do people really want it? So it can absolutely give you a lot of answers to those questions. It can also help you communicate your idea. So it's a lot easier if you're going to an investor or a decision maker, even your boss, if you can say, here's my idea, here's how it works. You can touch it, you can test it out, you can see it for yourself. It helps you actually communicate the value a lot better. As we said, it helps you fail quickly and cheaply. It allows you to test out those possibilities. And it helps you answer the questions that you might have around, do people actually want this? Will it actually work? And so we say that innovation happens at this sweet spot between feasibility, viability, and desirability. And we're testing to see, does my idea fit into this intersection? Feasible, meaning my technology works. It'll work the way I thought it would, or it'll actually perform what I want it to. It's viable, meaning that it's sustainable as a business. People are willing to pay for it, or I can afford to make it at this price point. And then the big question, is it desirable? Do human beings actually want it? Will they use it? Does it work for them the way we want it to? But more recently, this idea of the innovation sweet spot has been updated to add another circle that I think is important, which is integrity or impact, which is also what are the unintended side effects or consequences that might happen from this idea. This has been added into the idea of innovation recently because we've had a lot of innovations in the last 10 years that have had some pretty unintended consequences that we're all living with right now. Can anybody think of any big innovations that have happened that have sort of cause cascading challenges we might not have expected?
AI.
AI is destroying my life every day as a professor, absolutely. Maybe the unintended consequences of that technological advancement.
Sorry. So my knowledge in that area is not very great, but I know that electric cars are supposed to be eco-friendly. But I know that there's a lot of opinions about the way we mine lithium, which is actually used in those cars. So it's
another great example. I think you can pretty much pick any environmental changes we've tried to make, and you can think about them in that way. So we're eliminating the gas use of the car, but then are we having unintended side effects with the mining and the chemicals? You can also think even things as simple as we got rid of plastic bags. It's supposed to be good, right? But then we find out that in fact paper bags, because they're heavier, use more gas in transporting them, and there's all these other elements that go into it. So we have a really bad track record as a society of thinking about the impact of our innovations. So we want to try to think not just, is this an idea that will be profitable and that will work, but also what impact am I going to have on the planet beyond my idea, and how can I shape those things? And that brings us, I went slightly over time, but that brings us to the end of the lecture. I hope that was helpful in helping you understand what design thinking is and what the elements of it are. We're going to take a break, and then after the break, we're going to do a hands-on workshop and actually try out some of these skills. So I look forward to working with you in the second half of the workshop.